You are standing, in your mind, outside the walls of a fortified camp on the northeastern edge of Rome, in the year 193 of your era. Before you rises an earthen rampart, and atop it, armed men look down at a gathering crowd of senators, officials, and ordinary citizens pressing close against the barricades. Something is happening here that has never happened before in the history of the empire, and will, as far as any surviving record tells us, never happen in quite this way again. The throne of Rome, ruler of the known world's wealthiest and most extensive empire, is being sold. Not inherited. Not seized by conquest on some distant frontier. Sold, in the open air, to whichever wealthy Roman offers the largest sum of money to the soldiers standing on that rampart, the very men whose duty was to guard the emperor's life, and who had, only hours before, ended it. This is the story of the Praetorian Guard's auction of the Roman Empire, and of the man who won it, a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus, whose reign would last only 66 days before the empire's own frontier armies marched on the city to correct what its capital soldiers had done. It is also the story of the two emperors who fell before him within a single winter, and the three rival generals whose armies would spend the following 4 years fighting to decide who Rome's true master would finally be. Historians would eventually give this entire span of chaos a name reflecting its sheer improbability, the Year of the Five Emperors, though the full reckoning, as you will come to see, actually unfolded across several years rather than one alone, its opening act compressed into a single winter of astonishing velocity, its final resolution deferred until a battlefield in Gaul settled. At last, what a bidding war outside a Roman military camp had never truly been capable of settling on its own. We are not here tonight to treat this as a simple tale of greed and folly, though it certainly contains both. The auction did not emerge from nowhere. It was the outcome of decades of dangerous precedent, one in which the soldiers meant to protect Rome's ruler had gradually come to understand that they, not the Senate, not tradition, held the true power to make or unmake an emperor. Where our surviving sources, chiefly the historians Cassius, Dio, and Herodian, both writing with their own perspectives and, in Dio's case, direct personal experience of the Roman Senate during these very years, agree, this telling will speak plainly. Where they differ on details, it will say so. To understand how an empire's throne came to be sold like a plot of land or a shipment of grain, you must first understand the world that produced the men who allowed it to happen, a golden reign that ended, a spoiled heir who inherited it, and a guard that had spent generations quietly learning its own worth. That understanding begins not with the crisis itself, but with the reign of a philosopher who ruled wisely and then made, in his final decision, the one choice historians have argued over ever since, a choice whose consequences neither he nor anyone standing beside his deathbed could have fully anticipated. For nearly a century before the auction, Rome had enjoyed what later historians would come to regard as one of the most stable and prosperous stretches in the empire's long history. A period modern scholars often call the era of the Five Good Emperors, in which each ruler had selected and formally adopted a capable successor from outside his own bloodline rather than relying on the accident of hereditary birth. This practice of adoptive succession, whatever its origins in the simple biological misfortune of earlier emperors lacking natural sons of their own, had produced a remarkable run of capable, experienced rulers chosen for demonstrated competence rather than birth order. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and finally Marcus Aurelius himself, each adopted as a grown man already tested in administration or military command before ever assuming the throne. The philosopher Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who ruled from 161 to 180, stood as the culmination of this practice, a ruler whose private philosophical reflections, later published as his Meditations, presented an image of restrained, dutiful, almost self-denying leadership that Roman writers of his own and later generations held up as a model of what imperial rule at its best could achieve. Written largely during long military campaigns along the Danube frontier rather than in any comfort of the capital, these private notebooks reveal an emperor who saw his own power chiefly as a burden of duty rather than an entitlement to indulgence, precisely the temperament his own son would prove almost entirely without. Marcus Aurelius's reign was not without hardship. Plague swept the empire during his rule, likely carried home by soldiers returning from campaigns in the east against Parthia, killing a significant portion of the population across several provinces and straining the treasury and the army's own ranks considerably. Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier pressed against Roman defenses with a persistence that occupied much of his later years in difficult, grinding frontier warfare rather than the philosophical tranquility his writings might suggest. Campaigns Marcus Aurelius conducted personally rather than delegating entirely to subordinate generals, a hands-on style of rule his own son would abandon almost immediately upon inheriting the throne. Yet the empire held, its institutions functioning, its frontiers largely secure, its succession, until this point, orderly. It was Marcus Aurelius's own decision regarding his succession that would prove, in hindsight, the fatal break from the pattern that had preserved Roman stability for nearly a century. Rather than adopting a capable outsider as his own predecessors had done, he elevated his biological son, Commodus, to co-rule alongside him from the boy's early teenage years and then to sole rule upon his own death, the first time in generations that a Roman emperor's own natural son had inherited the throne directly. A return to hereditary succession that many senators of the period, writing after the fact with the benefit of hindsight, would come to regard as the empire's critical unforced error. Whether Marcus Aurelius could have chosen otherwise, given the political and dynastic pressures surrounding a living, adult son with his own household and supporters, remains a matter historians continue to debate. Abandoning Commodus in favor of an outside heir would have required overriding an established and expectant faction at court in a way none of his predecessors, choosing between rival adopted candidates rather than displacing a living son, had ever needed to attempt. Some ancient writers suggest Marcus Aurelius himself harbored private doubts about his son's temperament even before his death, though the surviving evidence for any serious alternative plan remains thin and largely speculative. What is not disputed is the outcome. An 18-year-old inherited, in 180, the largest and wealthiest empire the Western world had yet produced, at the very moment its long run of careful, deliberately chosen succession finally gave way to the ordinary accident of birth. For more than a decade before the auction, Rome had been ruled by this same Commodus, a man who had inherited the throne as a young adult from his father, and who had, over the course of his reign, alarmed the Roman elite with behavior most historians of the period regarded as a dangerous departure from the dignified restraint expected of a Roman ruler. Commodus's early years on the throne showed some continuity with his father's policies, particularly in ending the costly and grinding Danube frontier wars through negotiated settlement rather than continued campaigning, a pragmatic decision that spared the treasury and the legions further strain, though one some contemporary senators viewed as an abandonment of hard-won gains his father's generation had bled to secure across nearly 2 decades of difficult fighting. Ancient writers note that Commodus, unlike his father, showed little personal appetite for the discomforts of frontier command, preferring the comforts and entertainments of the capital to the muddy camps along the Danube where Marcus Aurelius had spent so much of his own reign. As his reign progressed, Commodus increasingly delegated the actual business of governing to favorites and freedmen while he pursued his own entertainments, a pattern that concentrated enormous resentment among the senatorial class who found themselves marginalized from real influence over imperial affairs they had, under previous emperors, meaningfully shared. Several of these favorites, including the powerful Praetorian prefect Cleander, amassed enormous personal wealth and influence, selling offices and honors while the emperor himself grew ever more distant from ordinary administration, a corruption of the state's normal functioning that left provincial governance increasingly erratic, dependent on the shifting favor of whichever courtier currently held Commodus's ear. By the final years of his reign, Commodus had survived multiple conspiracies against his life, including one led by his own sister, and grown increasingly erratic and paranoid in response. According to the surviving accounts, a paranoia that, ironically, only sharpened as his personal behavior grew stranger and gave his enemies genuine new grievances to act upon. The stage for his eventual assassination was set less by any single betrayal than by years of accumulated resentment among precisely the people closest to him, the ones with the most intimate access to his household and his person. Among the favorites who rose to power during Commodus's years of inattentive rule, none illustrates the dangers of delegated authority more starkly than Cleander, a former slave who rose through the imperial household to become, for a period, the most powerful man in Rome after the emperor himself, holding the office of Praetorian prefect and controlling access to imperial favor with an influence that considerably outstripped his official rank. Cleander's tenure was marked by the open sale of public offices, magistracies, and even senate seats to the highest bidder, a corruption of the state's normal functioning that enriched him enormously while degrading the competence and integrity of Rome's administrative class at nearly every level, filling government positions with men whose only qualification had been their willingness to pay Cleander directly for the honor. Cleander's downfall came in the year 190, precipitated by a genuine crisis in the capital's grain supply that left ordinary Romans facing real hunger amid a system of distribution Cleander himself was widely blamed for having manipulated or neglected for personal profit. Public anger, already primed by years of resentment at his corrupt sale of offices, erupted during a public event at the Circus Maximus, where a hostile crowd, reportedly encouraged by Commodus's own sister Fadilla, who had her own grievances against Cleander's influence at court, began chanting for his removal and eventually marched on the palace itself demanding his death. Commodus, recognizing the genuine danger the mob's fury posed to his own position should it not be given a target to satisfy its anger, had Cleander seized and executed on the spot, his severed head paraded before the crowd to calm the unrest. A swift and brutal sacrifice of a once untouchable favorite that restored a fragile calm to the capital while doing nothing to address the underlying pattern of corrupt, delegated rule that had produced the crisis in the first place. The episode offers a telling preview of the dynamics that would recur, in far more consequential form, 3 years later, an emperor increasingly disconnected from the actual business of governing, a capital city whose population possessed genuine power to make its displeasure felt through open unrest, and a political system willing to sacrifice even its most powerful servants the moment they became more useful dead than alive to the man who had elevated them. Nothing captured the Roman elite's growing alarm at Commodus's behavior more vividly than his personal identification, in his final years, with the demigod Hercules, an obsession that moved from private eccentricity to public spectacle in ways that struck at the very dignity the imperial office was supposed to embody. Commodus began appearing in public wearing a lion's skin and carrying a club in conscious imitation of Hercules, had statues of himself erected in this guise across the city, and reportedly considered renaming Rome itself as a colony bearing his own adopted Herculean title, along with renaming the months of the calendar and even the Senate and the legions after variations of his own name and honors. A wholesale rebranding of the state's most fundamental institutions around his own person that struck contemporaries as a genuinely alarming break from any prior emperor's self-conception, however grand. Most notoriously, Commodus fought as a gladiator in the arena himself, an act that ordinary Roman aristocrats found deeply beneath the dignity of the imperial office, whatever popularity it may have earned him among the city's common crowds who filled the amphitheater to watch him. Cassius Dio, who claims to have witnessed some of these performances directly from the senatorial seating, describes an atmosphere of genuine fear among the assembled senators, forced to applaud an emperor performing a role Roman tradition had always associated with slaves, criminals, and the socially disgraced, and reportedly required to do so in ceremonial garb specifically distinguishing them, uncomfortably, as an audience compelled to honor a spectacle they privately regarded as a degradation of the office itself. Commodus staged elaborate hunts in the arena as well, personally killing exotic animals imported from across the empire's provinces, ostriches, lions, elephants, before delighted or unnerved crowds, often from an elevated, protected platform that minimized any genuine personal risk despite the display's carefully staged appearance of raw physical courage. Dio records one particular episode in which Commodus, having dispatched a number of ostriches in the arena, approached the senatorial seating afterward brandishing a sword and holding up one of the bird's severed heads, a gesture several senators reportedly understood as a thinly veiled threat regarding what might happen to any of them who displeased him, an anecdote that, whatever embellishment it may have accumulated in the retelling, captures precisely the atmosphere of menace beneath the spectacle's surface entertainment. By the end of his reign, the gap between Commodus's self-image as a living Hercules, beloved by the common people who filled his amphitheater, and the senatorial elite's private horror at what the imperial office had become, had grown into an unbridgeable chasm, one that left him, however popular he may have remained with parts of the city's population, dangerously isolated from the very class of powerful men whose cooperation any Roman emperor needed to survive. It was from within this same isolated inner circle, rather than from the wider Senate or army, that his final undoing would ultimately come. The conspiracy that finally ended Commodus's reign drew together three figures with intimate access to his household: Marcia, his favorite mistress and effectively his consort in all but formal title, Eclectus, his chamberlain and one of the most trusted freedmen in his personal service, and Quintus Aemilius Laetus, the newly appointed Praetorian prefect commanding the very guard meant to protect the emperor's life. According to the fullest surviving accounts, all three had genuine personal reason to fear for their own safety, having learned or suspected that their names appeared on a list of individuals Commodus intended to have executed the following morning, on the very first day of the new year, a list Marcia is said to have discovered by accident among the emperor's private papers left carelessly within her reach. Faced with the prospect of their own deaths, and with almost no time remaining before the planned executions, the three conspirators moved first to poison Commodus, having Marcia administer a tainted portion of food or drink, possibly beef, during an evening meal. The poison, however, proved insufficiently strong or was partially expelled through vomiting, inducing severe illness rather than death, a failure that forced the conspirators to improvise a second, more direct method before the emperor could recover enough to investigate what had happened to him and discover their involvement. The conspirators enlisted a professional wrestler and athlete named Narcissus, who had access to the emperor's private quarters as part of his ordinary duties attending Commodus's physical exercises, to finish what the poison had failed to accomplish. According to the surviving accounts, Narcissus strangled Commodus in his bathing chamber on the final night of the year 192, ending, without any public spectacle or battlefield drama, the reign of a man who had spent his final years imagining himself as an invincible demigod before an adoring arena crowd. The irony of his death, achieved through simple strangulation rather than any weapon or contest, was not lost on ancient writers eager to draw a moral contrast with the theatrical, staged combats he had spent his final years performing. The manner of Commodus's death, quiet, private, arranged by people who had served him closely for years, offered an early preview of the pattern that would recur throughout the crisis to come. Emperors of this era, however outwardly powerful, remained perpetually vulnerable to the very people closest to them, whether household intimates or the armed men sworn to their protection. And the conspirators who moved against Commodus had, crucially, already arranged a successor before carrying out the killing, determined not to leave Rome without an emperor even for a single day. A lesson in careful succession planning. The assassins themselves would apply far more successfully than the chaos that followed Pertinax's own death just 3 months later. The conspirators had already selected a successor before carrying out the killing. Pertinax, an elderly and highly respected senator who had served in a long string of senior military and administrative posts across his career, including a stint as city prefect of Rome itself and, decades earlier, command in the very Danube campaigns Marcus Aurelius had personally led. Pertinax was, by most surviving assessments, a genuinely capable and reform-minded choice, a former soldier's son who had risen entirely through demonstrated competence rather than inherited connection, precisely the kind of figure the exhausted Senate hoped might restore some measure of discipline and dignity to an office Commodus had spent years degrading. Pertinax accepted the throne, reportedly with some reluctance given the obvious danger of the position, and immediately set about the kind of reforms his predecessor's excesses had made necessary. He inherited an imperial treasury that Commodus's extravagance had left severely depleted, and a Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers stationed in Rome itself, tasked with protecting the emperor's person, that had grown accustomed, across recent reigns, to enormous cash donatives at each new emperor's accession, along with a general culture of indulgence and lax discipline that Commodus's own inattentive rule had done nothing to correct. The new emperor moved quickly to address the empire's finances, auctioning off luxury items accumulated by Commodus, including exotic animals, gladiatorial equipment, and lavish furnishings the previous emperor had collected without any real fiscal restraint, reducing extravagant expenditures across the court, and attempting to restore the kind of fiscal discipline his own long career in provincial administration had trained him to value. He also moved, more dangerously, to restore military discipline within the Praetorian Guard itself, insisting on standards of conduct and training the Guard had not been held to in years, and, critically, failing to deliver a donative on the scale the soldiers had come to expect as their due for accepting a new emperor, offering instead a comparatively modest sum his depleted treasury could genuinely afford. This combination proved combustible. The Praetorian Guard, resentful of both the reduced generosity and the renewed discipline, grew increasingly restless within weeks of Pertinax's accession. A first attempted mutiny, in which a group of soldiers attempted to elevate a rival senator to the throne in Pertinax's place while the emperor himself was away from the city, was suppressed. But it revealed exactly how fragile the new emperor's hold on the Guard's loyalty had become, and how little genuine deterrent effect its failure had produced among the wider body of resentful soldiers. Pertinax, to his credit by the account of most surviving historians, continued to govern with evident seriousness and reforming intent despite these warning signs, addressing the Senate with what Cassius Dio, who sat in that very Senate and heard these speeches himself, described as genuine statesmanship, a marked contrast to the spectacle Commodus's final years had made of imperial governance. To understand how a body of soldiers could come to believe it held the right to depose one emperor and sell the throne to his successor's replacement, it helps to understand the Praetorian Guard's own long and troubled history within Roman political life, a history stretching back more than 2 centuries before this crisis to the very founding of the imperial office itself. The Guard had been formally established under Rome's first emperor, Augustus, ostensibly as a personal bodyguard and elite garrison stationed in and around the capital, distinguished from ordinary legionary troops by higher pay, shorter terms of service, and a privileged barracks located within the city itself rather than on some distant frontier, a concentration of trained, armed men within the capital that no previous phase of Roman political history, dominated by the citizen soldier armies of the Republic, had ever permitted so close to the seat of civilian government. From nearly its earliest years, however, the Guard's unique position, the only substantial armed force permanently stationed in Rome, with direct physical access to the emperor's household, gave it a political leverage that emperors ever afterward had to manage carefully. The assassination of the Emperor Caligula in the year 41, carried out in part by Praetorian officers themselves acting on personal grievances against his erratic and cruel behavior, was followed almost immediately by the Guard's own soldiers discovering Caligula's uncle Claudius hiding behind a curtain in the palace and acclaiming him emperor on the spot, reportedly securing his position with the Senate only after the fact, through the plain threat of the Guard's own armed backing, the first clear instance of the pattern that would recur, in far more transactional form, in the events surrounding Pertinax and Julianus a century and a half later. The Guard's influence continued to assert itself at various points across the following century and a half, playing a decisive role in several subsequent successions and, notoriously, in the chaotic year of the 4 emperors in 69, when rival armies across the empire's provinces each proclaimed their own commander-emperor within the span of a single turbulent year, a precedent every soldier and senator living through the crisis of 193 would have known well, whether from direct family memory or the historical writing of the intervening century. Emperors of the intervening decades had responded to this recurring danger in different ways, some cultivating the Guard's loyalty through generous pay and privilege, others attempting, with limited success, to curb its independent political weight through careful management of its command structure. By the time of Pertinax's brief reign, the Praetorian Guard had, across generations, absorbed a clear if unspoken lesson from this long institutional history, that the office of emperor, whatever its formal dignity and constitutional trappings, ultimately depended on the practical loyalty of armed men close enough to enforce or withdraw it, and that soldiers who controlled that loyalty held leverage no amount of Senate ceremony could fully override. The auction that followed Pertinax's death was less a sudden invention than the logical, if unusually blunt, conclusion of a lesson the Guard had been absorbing since the earliest decades of the empire itself. It was not enough that Pertinax governed with reforming seriousness. Roughly 12 weeks into his reign, a larger group of Praetorian soldiers, aggrieved and increasingly convinced the new emperor threatened their privileged position, and reportedly encouraged by officers who feared punishment for their own role in the earlier failed mutiny, marched on the imperial palace itself. According to the fullest surviving accounts, several hundred Praetorian soldiers marched on the palace, catching the emperor's household largely by surprise, and Pertinax, informed of their approach, made the decision not to flee but to face them directly, a choice several ancient historians frame as consistent with the personal courage that had marked his long military career. Whatever else might be said of the wisdom of the decision in the moment, when a swifter escape might conceivably have preserved his life if only for a while longer. Pertinax reportedly attempted to address the soldiers directly, hoping his authority and his record of service might yet calm the situation, in the same way his measured speeches had, until this point, managed to hold the Senate's confidence. Cassius Dio records that Pertinax's calm, direct manner briefly seemed to unsettle the advancing soldiers, several of whom reportedly hesitated or lowered their weapons at his approach. A moment of genuine possibility that a single instigator among the mutineers apparently broke by striking the first blow before hesitation could spread further through the ranks. Accounts describe the emperor being cut down within the palace grounds by the mutinous soldiers shortly afterward, his death coming swiftly rather than through any prolonged confrontation. His head, according to several surviving sources, was severed and carried back to the Praetorian camp on a spear, a grim, symbolic assertion of the guard's role in his death, and an unmistakable signal to the city of Rome regarding where real power over the throne now resided, whatever the Senate's formal constitutional role might still nominally suggest. Pertinax had reigned for approximately 87 days. His death left Rome without an emperor for the second time within 3 months, and this time, the men responsible for his death were the very soldiers stationed inside the city walls, in full control of the situation, with no rival army or faction immediately positioned to challenge them. In the hours immediately following Pertinax's killing, Rome existed in a genuinely unprecedented state of suspended authority, a city of perhaps 1 million people, the administrative center of an empire spanning 3 continents, with no emperor, no clear successor, and a body of armed men in full physical control of the only force capable of enforcing order in the capital. The Senate, meeting in what surviving accounts describe as an atmosphere of genuine confusion and fear, held no practical mechanism of its own to resist the guard's will, having no independent armed force of comparable strength stationed anywhere near the city to counterbalance the soldiers now holding effective control of the succession, a structural vulnerability the Senate had lived with for 2 centuries but rarely felt so nakedly exposed by ordinary residents of Rome, according to later historians writing with the benefit of hindsight, sensed correctly that the killing of Pertinax had exposed something the city's official ceremonies and constitutional formulas had always worked hard to obscure, that the emperor's authority rested, in the final analysis, on the willingness of armed men to enforce it, and that willingness could evaporate or be redirected toward the highest bidder far more quickly than any Senate debate could respond to. Shops reportedly closed and streets grew quiet in parts of the city as word spread of the killing, residents uncertain whether further violence might follow before any new authority could be established. It was within this vacuum of authority, the guard fully aware of its own leverage, the Senate paralyzed, the city holding its breath, that the Praetorian officers made the decision that would scandalize the empire for generations afterward, rather than simply proclaiming a successor of their own choosing. As the Guard had done with Claudius more than a century earlier, they would offer the position openly to whichever wealthy Roman was willing to pay the most for it, converting the empire's highest office into something disturbingly close to a piece of property changing hands at the highest offer, a step beyond even the Guard's own long history of interference in the succession that even contemporary observers accustomed to that history found genuinely shocking in its bluntness. The decision required no formal vote or written proclamation among the Guard's officers, so far as any surviving source describes, merely a rapid, informal consensus among men who had just committed murder and now needed some means of converting that act into lasting personal advantage before the wider city or the frontier armies could organize any response of their own. Speed mattered enormously to the soldiers in this calculation. Whoever emerged from the camp gates as the newly acclaimed emperor needed to be installed swiftly enough that the Senate would have little practical choice but to ratify a decision already backed by the only significant armed force within the city walls, foreclosing any opportunity for senators to organize an alternative candidate of their own before the Guard's chosen buyer could be formally seated on the throne. To understand the scene unfolding outside the Praetorian camp, it helps to hold in mind the sheer scale and texture of the city where this crisis was playing out. The largest urban settlement the Western world had yet produced, home, by most modern population estimates, to somewhere close to 1 million residents packed into a dense sprawl of apartment blocks, markets, temples, and public monuments radiating outward from the Forum at its ancient civic and religious heart. The Palatine Hill, rising above the Forum, held the sprawling complex of the imperial palace itself, expanded and rebuilt by successive emperors until it had become less a single residence than an entire administrative city in miniature, housing not only the emperor's household but the small army of freedmen, secretaries, and officials who kept the actual machinery of imperial government running day to day regardless of which man currently occupied the throne. Beyond the monumental core of temples, basilicas, and imperial forums that visitors in later ages would come to associate most strongly with the city, ordinary Rome consisted overwhelmingly of dense, multi-story apartment blocks called insulae, often poorly built and prone to fire or collapse, housing the bulk of the city's population in conditions considerably less grand than the marble facades of its public architecture might suggest. Public baths, distributed across every district of the city, served as genuine centers of daily social life for residents across the social spectrum, while the ongoing distribution of subsidized grain to eligible citizens, a policy stretching back generations, remained one of the most politically sensitive functions any Roman government needed to manage without interruption, whatever crisis might currently be unfolding at the political summit of the state. It was against this backdrop of genuine urban scale and complexity, a city whose daily functioning depended on systems of supply, administration, and public order that had nothing directly to do with which general or senator currently held the throne, that the drama of the Praetorian camp unfolded, watched by a population whose immediate daily concerns of bread, work, and family continued regardless of the outcome, even as the identity of their ultimate ruler hung, for those few remarkable hours, on nothing more than which bidder could offer the soldiers on the rampart the largest sum of coined silver and gold. Before he became the punchline of one of Roman history's most notorious episodes, Didius Julianus had built a genuinely respectable, if unremarkable, senatorial career spanning several decades of ordinary imperial service. Born to a family of provincial origin with connections in both Italy and North Africa, he had risen through the standard sequence of Roman public offices, serving as a legionary commander, holding governorships in provinces including Belgica, Dalmatia, and Germania Inferior, and reaching the consulship years before the crisis that would define his historical memory. A career profile broadly similar, in its outline, to many other senior senators of his generation, none of it suggesting the singular episode for which history would remember him above all else. By 193, Julianus was an older man, already past his prime years of active provincial administration, living in comparative retirement in Rome and, by most accounts, considerably wealthier than the ordinary senator thanks to a long and evidently profitable career navigating imperial service. Cassius Dio's account suggests Julianus's own family, rather than the man himself, provided much of the initial impetus that carried him to the Praetorian camp on the night of the auction. His wife and daughter reportedly among those urging him to seize an opportunity his own more cautious instincts might otherwise have hesitated over. Whatever combination of personal ambition, family pressure, and simple opportunism finally moved him toward the camp gates that night, the decision would define the remainder of his life and reduce a genuinely long and creditable senatorial career to a single, infamous transaction, a reminder of how completely a single choice, made in the charged and chaotic hours following an emperor's murder, could override decades of otherwise ordinary and unremarkable public service in the judgment of history. What happened next is recorded, with slight variations in detail, by both of our principal surviving sources, and it remains one of the most startling episodes in the entire history of the Roman Principate. The Praetorian Guard, having killed Pertinax, retreated to their fortified camp on the edge of the city and announced, openly, that the imperial throne would go to whoever offered the soldiers the largest cash donative. Picture the physical scene as the sources describe it: an earthen rampart topped with a timber palisade, armed soldiers looking down from the walls, and below them, in the open ground before the camp's main gate, a gathering and increasingly agitated crowd of onlookers, senators anxious to see how the crisis would resolve, ordinary Romans drawn by rumor and disbelief, and, moving among them, the two men who would shortly turn this scene into the empire's strangest transaction. Two principal bidders emerged. The first was Titus Flavius Sulpicianus, Pertinax's own father-in-law and city prefect of Rome, who went to the Praetorian camp in person to negotiate whether to secure the throne for himself or, as some ancient accounts suggest, initially to try to calm the situation on the Senate's behalf, before the momentum of events pulled him into bidding directly, the gates admitting him inside while the crowd outside grew steadily larger and more uncertain of what precisely was unfolding behind the walls. The second was Didius Julianus, a wealthy senator and former consul with extensive administrative experience across several provinces, who arrived at the camp after being alerted, according to Cassius Dio's account, by friends and family urging him to seize the extraordinary opportunity unfolding before the walls, reportedly interrupting a dinner at his own home to rush to the scene once word reached him. Finding the gates initially closed to him while Sulpicianus negotiated within, Julianus reportedly stood outside and began shouting his own bids up to the soldiers on the ramparts, turning the succession of the Roman Empire into something disturbingly close to a literal, audible auction conducted across a fortification wall. The assembled crowd below watching in evident disbelief as two Roman senators competed for the throne in terms usually reserved for a market stall or a slave sale. Sulpicianus's position, negotiating from inside the Praetorian camp itself while a rival bidder shouted competing offers from beyond the gate, gave him a genuine tactical advantage in the early stages of the bidding, allowing him direct access to the soldiers weighing each offer and the ability to gauge their reactions in real time in a way Julianus, confined outside the walls, initially could not match. As Pertinax's father-in-law, Sulpicianus also carried a claim rooted in continuity rather than pure novelty, a connection to the reforming emperor the Guard had just killed, which some ancient accounts suggest he hoped might work in his favor as a gesture of stability, even as the circumstances of his bid made any appeal to dignified continuity almost self-contradictory. Cassius Dio records that Sulpicianus's initial offers, made from within the security of the camp itself, climbed steadily as the negotiations progressed, the soldiers relaying each new figure to their comrades along the ramparts and gauging the crowd's reaction as much as their own private calculations of the sum's adequacy. For a period of the negotiation, Sulpicianus appeared genuinely likely to prevail, his physical presence within the camp and his established position as city prefect giving him a practical advantage his rival, still shouting from beyond the walls, could not easily overcome through financial terms alone. Yet this same connection to Pertinax ultimately worked against Sulpicianus in the calculations of the watching soldiers. Julianus's supporters, according to Cassius Dio's account, reportedly reminded the Guard from outside the walls that a man closely related by marriage to the murdered emperor might, once secure on the throne, seek retribution against the very soldiers who had killed his son-in-law, a danger that gave the soldiers genuine reason to distrust Sulpicianus's ultimate intentions regardless of how competitive his cash offers proved to be. The irony of Sulpicianus's position deserves notice. A senior, respected official with every practical advantage of proximity and continuity, undone in the end not by being outbid in strictly financial terms alone, but by the soldiers' own calculated fear of what his victory might eventually cost them personally. Proof that even in an auction reduced to raw cash terms, the soldiers retained enough political calculation to weigh consequences beyond the immediate sum being offered, a calculation that would, in a bitter irony neither man could have foreseen, prove entirely irrelevant to their own eventual fate once Rome's frontier armies finally arrived. Didius Julianus arrived at the Praetorian camp already a man of considerable wealth and administrative accomplishment, having served as consul and held governorships across several provinces during a long senatorial career, credentials that, under ordinary circumstances, might have made him a plausible if unremarkable candidate for high office, but which offered no particular claim to the throne itself beyond the raw fact of his ability to pay for it. Accounts describe Julianus initially finding the camp gates closed to him while Sulpicianus negotiated within, standing outside the walls and calling up his bids directly to the soldiers positioned along the ramparts above him, a physically undignified posture for a Roman senator of his rank and years, reduced to shouting sums of money upward at armed men who held, in that moment, more genuine authority over the fate of the empire than the entire assembled Senate meeting anxiously across the city. Herodian's account adds the detail that Julianus, growing impatient at the gate's closure, resorted to holding up his fingers to signal ever higher sums to the soldiers above, a scene later writers found difficult to describe without evident distaste at the spectacle of a Roman senator reduced to hand signals in a bidding contest for the empire itself. The bidding climbed steadily, each man raising his offer of a cash donative per soldier as the guards relayed figures back and forth between the two candidates on either side of the wall. Julianus, determined and increasingly extravagant in his promises, continued to raise his own offer from outside the walls, reportedly reminding the soldiers, as already noted, of the danger Sulpicianus might pose to them personally, given his relationship to the murdered Pertinax and any desire for reprisal that connection might eventually produce. Julianus ultimately won with a promise reported by Cassius Dio at 25,000 sesterces per soldier, an almost unimaginably vast sum multiplied across the many thousands of men in the guard, dwarfing any previous accession donative in Roman history. The soldiers, satisfied, opened the gates fully, acclaimed Julianus emperor, and escorted him back into the city under armed guard to have the Senate formally, if reluctantly, confirm what the Praetorian camp had already decided. Didius Julianus did not ascend to the throne alone. Roman custom extended imperial titles to an emperor's immediate family as well, and in the days following his purchase of the throne, his wife, Manlia Scintilla, and his daughter, Didia Clara, were both formally granted the title of Augusta by the Senate, elevating them, at least in ceremonial terms, to the highest rank available to Roman women. Surviving coinage confirms both women's brief elevation, their portraits struck alongside the customary titles and imagery reserved for empresses of far more secure and legitimate reigns. A strange physical record of two women thrust into the empire's highest ceremonial female rank on the strength of a transaction concluded in a matter of hours outside a military camp. The surviving sources say little of what either woman made of this sudden and precarious elevation, though the general hostility directed at Julianus himself throughout his brief reign can hardly have left his household untouched by the same public contempt. Didia Clara, married into a family of senatorial standing, found her own position and prospects abruptly transformed twice within the span of 2 months, first elevated to the empire's highest female rank, then, following her father's execution, thrust back into private life in whatever quiet obscurity a family so publicly associated with the empire's most notorious purchased succession could still manage to secure. Their brief and precarious elevation offers a small but telling coda to the larger crisis, an entire household, innocent of the actual bidding that had unfolded outside the Praetorian camp, nonetheless swept up into the same current of naked transaction and swift reversal that would define the reign's entire brief and unhappy course, their fortunes rising and falling in exact step with a purchase none of them had personally negotiated, but all of them were made, however briefly, to embody in the eyes of a deeply unimpressed Roman public. The Senate, presented with an armed escort and a fait accompli, formally confirmed Didius Julianus as emperor, a ratification most senators understood to be a matter of survival rather than genuine consent, given the soldiers now controlling the city on his behalf. Cassius Dio, who witnessed these Senate proceedings directly, describes an atmosphere of barely concealed resentment and fear rather than any authentic enthusiasm for the new ruler. Senators reportedly offering the customary acclamations in tones Dio characterizes as hollow and forced rather than sincere. Public reaction outside the Senate chamber was, by every surviving account, openly hostile in a way rarely directed so nakedly at a sitting Roman emperor. Crowds in the streets reportedly jeered at Julianus as he processed through the city, and some accounts describe open calls for the frontier legions to march on Rome and remove a man the ordinary population regarded, correctly, as having purchased his position rather than earned it through any legitimate claim. The manner of his accession had, in the public imagination, permanently stained whatever legitimate authority the office might otherwise have carried. Julianus attempted, during his brief reign, to govern with some appearance of normalcy, addressing financial matters, receiving foreign delegations, and undertaking the ordinary ceremonial functions expected of a Roman emperor, including presiding over public games in an effort to win over a populace that greeted his every public appearance with open contempt rather than the customary displays of loyalty a Roman emperor could ordinarily expect. But the manner of his accession had fatally undermined any authority he might otherwise have claimed, both with the Roman public and, more dangerously, with the powerful provincial armies stationed along the empire's frontiers, who had played no part whatsoever in selecting him and owed the Praetorian Guard's transaction no loyalty at all. Beyond the formal hostility recorded in the Senate and the streets, several more specific and telling anecdotes survive from Julianus's brief reign, illustrating just how thoroughly Roman public opinion had rejected the legitimacy of his purchased throne. Ancient sources describe crowds gathering at the Circus Maximus during public games shouting insults directed at the new emperor even as he presided over the events from the imperial box, a level of open contempt rarely directed so publicly at a reigning Roman ruler under ordinary circumstances, with some accounts describing chants openly invoking Severus's name as the crowd's preferred alternative well before his army had even crossed into Italy. Some accounts describe residents of Rome openly invoking the approaching Septimius Severus by name in public gatherings before his army had even come within sight of the city, treating his eventual arrival as a foregone conclusion and Julianus's removal as a matter of when rather than if, a remarkable public confidence in the outcome of a military situation still, in strict terms, entirely unresolved, and one that left Julianus's own supporters, such as they were, increasingly unwilling to be seen publicly associating with a ruler the wider population had so thoroughly already condemned. Julianus himself, according to several surviving accounts, grew increasingly desperate as these signs of his failing position accumulated, reportedly consulting religious diviners and even, by some accounts, attempting to perform rituals associated with necromancy in a bid to divine the outcome of the unfolding crisis, behavior that, whatever its basis in fact, reflects the genuine atmosphere of desperation surrounding a ruler who understood, correctly, that his purchased legitimacy commanded no real loyalty capable of surviving contact with an approaching army. Herodian describes Julianus attempting, with little apparent success, to shore up his position by ordering fortifications strengthened around the palace and attempting to raise additional troops from among the city's population, measures that accomplished little beyond confirming to the wider city just how precarious his hold on power had become. The city's refusal to grant Julianus even the outward deference Roman custom normally extended to a sitting emperor illustrates something important about the limits of the auction's success. The Guard could sell the office, and the Senate could be compelled to ratify the sale, but neither institution possessed the power to compel genuine belief in the transaction's legitimacy among the wider population, or among the armies whose loyalty had never been consulted at all. For any Roman familiar with their own empire's history, the crisis of 193 carried an unmistakable echo of an earlier catastrophe more than a century before. The year of the four emperors in 69, when the suicide of the Emperor Nero left the succession unsettled and four separate claimants, each backed by a different regional army, seized and lost the throne in rapid, bloody succession within a single turbulent year. That earlier crisis had established, in the plainest possible terms, the same lesson the Praetorian Guard would apply with such transactional bluntness more than a century later, that the true foundation of imperial power lay not in Senate ceremony or hereditary bloodline, but in the loyalty of whichever armed force stood closest and strongest at the moment of crisis. The historian Tacitus, writing in the decades following the earlier crisis, had famously observed that the secret of empire had been revealed by that chaos, that an emperor could be made outside Rome itself, by provincial armies rather than the city's own institutions, a lesson every ambitious general and every calculating soldier in the empire's subsequent history carried forward. whether they had read Tacitus's own account or simply absorbed the lesson through the oral memory of military tradition passed down within the legions across the intervening decades. By 193, this lesson had been reinforced rather than forgotten. The frontier legions in Pannonia, Syria, and Britain, each commanded by an ambitious and capable general, understood perfectly well that their own collective loyalty represented a form of political capital at least as valuable as anything the comparatively pampered Praetorian Guard in Rome could claim. And the news of Julianus's purchased throne, rather than settling the crisis, effectively announced to every frontier commander that the imperial office was, for the moment, entirely up for grabs by whichever army could reach Rome first with sufficient force to make its claim stick. Contemporary observers, aware of this precedent, understood almost immediately that the auction could not possibly be the final word on the succession, that a throne purchased with money rather than secured through the loyalty of a genuine army stood on foundations far too thin to survive contact with commanders who possessed exactly the kind of military backing Julianus so conspicuously lacked. The first and most consequential challenge came from Septimius Severus, commander of the legions stationed in Pannonia along the Danube frontier, a seasoned general with a large, battle-hardened army at his direct disposal and, crucially, a much shorter march to Rome than his rivals in the east and west. Severus's troops proclaimed him emperor within days of the news from Rome reaching his camp, and he began moving south toward Italy almost immediately, moving with a speed that would leave his rivals no time to properly organize a response. Nearly simultaneously, Pescennius Niger, governor of Syria and commander of the empire's eastern legions, was acclaimed emperor by his own troops, a claim with genuine appeal given his experience and the size of the eastern armies under his command, though the greater distance separating Syria from Italy meant he could not move on the capital with anything like Severus's speed. A third claimant, Clodius Albinus, governor of Britain and commander of the legion stationed there, also entered the contest, though initially in a more cautious position. Severus, recognizing the danger of fighting two rivals simultaneously, moved quickly to neutralize this third threat by offering Albinus the rank of Caesar, a form of junior queruleship, buying his temporary neutrality while Severus dealt with the more immediate threat posed by the situation in Rome itself. In Rome, the Senate and the increasingly desperate Didius Julianus watched Severus's rapid approach with growing alarm. Julianus reportedly attempted to have Severus declared a public enemy, sent assassins to intercept him, and even attempted to negotiate a form of joint rule, all of it to no effect, as Severus's legions continued their march largely unopposed, city after city along the route declaring for the approaching general rather than resisting on behalf of an emperor whose claim to the throne rested on nothing more than a bidding war outside a military camp. The Praetorian Guard itself, sensing which way events were moving and eager to avoid the consequences of having installed a ruler about to be violently deposed, began negotiating their own survival. A pattern of self-preservation entirely consistent with the transactional logic that had produced the auction in the first place. Septimius Severus's own background made his rise to the throne a genuinely remarkable episode in Roman social and political history, quite apart from the drama of the crisis that carried him there. Born in the North African city of Leptis Magna, in what is now Libya, to a prosperous local family of equestrian rank, Severus represented a provincial background considerably removed from the traditional Italian senatorial elite that had, until this period, dominated the highest reaches of Roman imperial politics. Ancient sources note, with varying degrees of comment, that Severus retained a distinctive North African accent throughout his life, a detail some contemporary Roman aristocrats reportedly regarded with the same mixture of curiosity and condescension that provincial origins often attracted within the capital's more insular social circles. Whatever genuine respect his military competence eventually earned him. His early career carried him through a series of legal and administrative posts across several provinces before his eventual appointment to command the Pannonian legions, a path that reflected a Roman imperial system genuinely capable of advancing talented provincial men to its highest military commands, whatever lingering social prejudice they might still encounter along the way. Severus's own political instincts, sharpened across decades of provincial administration and military command, proved considerably more sophisticated than the crude transactional logic that had produced the Praetorian auction. Rather than simply seizing power through raw military force alone, he moved carefully to construct a broader claim to legitimacy, declaring his intention to avenge Pertinax's murder, adopting the dead emperor's name into his own official titulature as Pertinax's self-proclaimed successor and avenger, and initially presenting his march on Rome as an act of justice rather than naked usurpation, a framing that offered the Senate and the wider public a far more palatable narrative than a second. Raw auction or conquest. His approach to the Praetorian Guard itself, once he reached Rome, would prove equally calculated, rather than simply massacring the soldiers responsible for Pertinax's death and the subsequent auction outright, an act that might have satisfied immediate anger but risked destabilizing the city further. Severus chose a more theatrical and controlled humiliation, one this telling will return to once his rivals to the east and west have been properly introduced. The physical experience of Severus's advance on Rome, though sparsely detailed in the surviving sources compared to the drama of the auction itself, deserves attention in its own right, since it illustrates just how quickly a determined and well-organized Roman army could cover the roughly 800 miles separating the Pannonian frontier from the capital along the empire's well-maintained network of military roads. Severus reportedly covered this distance in a matter of weeks rather than the months such a march might have required of a less disciplined force, moving his legions at a pace that left little time for Julianus's increasingly desperate countermeasures to take meaningful effect, and giving city after city along the route scarcely any opportunity to consider resistance before the approaching army had already passed through or received their formal submission. Ancient accounts describe Severus traveling for a portion of the march in ordinary military dress rather than any ceremonial finery, sharing the physical hardships of the road with his soldiers in a manner reminiscent of Marcus Aurelius's own personal style of command decades earlier, a detail later writers seized upon as evidence of the genuine discipline and soldierly character that distinguished his claim to the throne from Julianus's purchased and comparatively effete legitimacy. Towns and cities along the route, faced with an approaching army their own limited garrisons had no realistic hope of resisting, and having already heard of the Roman public's overwhelming hostility toward the sitting emperor in the capital, offered their submission and provisions freely rather than risk the consequences of resistance. By the time Severus's forces came within sight of Rome itself, the outcome of the crisis had, in every practical sense, already been decided. The Senate's formal condemnation of Julianus and confirmation of Severus arriving less as a genuine political decision than as an acknowledgement of a military reality that had been obvious for weeks. Severus reportedly entered the city not through violent conquest but through a carefully staged formal entry, received by the Senate and a wary populace alike as the clear and unopposed master of the situation. The empire's brief and disorienting experiment in purchased succession brought to its quiet, anticlimactic end. Severus's rise to power was, in significant part, a family enterprise built alongside his wife Julia Domna, a woman from a prominent priestly family in the Syrian city of Emesa whose own political acumen and personal ambition would shape the dynasty her husband was about to found in ways contemporary and later Roman writers found genuinely remarkable for a woman of her era. Julia Domna's family had long held hereditary religious authority connected to the worship of a Syrian sun deity, a background that brought both genuine wealth and a reputation, embellished considerably by later writers, for expertise in astrology and prophetic insight, a reputation some ancient sources suggest Severus himself took seriously enough to have consulted horoscopes before deciding to marry her at all, reportedly having heard of a prophecy that she was destined to marry a king. Once established as empress, Julia Domna would go on to exercise a degree of public influence unusual for a Roman empress of any era, accompanying her husband on many of his military campaigns rather than remaining secluded in Rome, and later serving as a genuine political counselor and, during the reigns of her sons, an active administrator managing correspondence and state business in ways that drew both admiration and pointed criticism from Roman writers uncomfortable with a woman wielding such visible authority. Her household reportedly became a genuine center of intellectual life as well, gathering philosophers, physicians, and scholars whose company she cultivated even amid the demands of imperial politics. The marriage produced two sons, Caracalla and Geta, born only a year apart, whose eventual joint and then bitterly rivalrous succession to their father's throne would itself become one of the more notorious episodes of the following reign. But in 193, with Severus's legions still marching on Rome and two rival claimants yet to be defeated, all of this lay in an unwritten future. The family's ultimate fate is unsettled as the empire whose throne their patriarch was racing to secure. Pescennius Niger's claim to the throne rested on genuinely substantial foundations: command of the empire's wealthy and populous eastern provinces, a large standing army accustomed to campaigning against Rome's traditional Parthian rivals along the eastern frontier, and a personal popularity in the region that several surviving accounts describe as considerable, particularly among the eastern cities that had prospered under his provincial administration and welcomed the prospect of an emperor drawn from their own region of the empire. Niger's fatal disadvantage was simply one of geography and timing. Syria lay a considerably greater distance from Italy than Severus's Pannonian frontier command, and the logistics of moving a large army that distance, across difficult terrain and through territory that required careful management of supply and local political relationships along the way, cost Niger months that Severus, moving on a much shorter interior line, simply did not need to spend. Some ancient accounts also suggest Niger himself moved with less urgency than the crisis demanded, perhaps underestimating how swiftly his rival in Pannonia would act, or overestimating the security his eastern popularity alone might provide against a genuinely determined rival. By the time Niger's forces were genuinely prepared to contest the throne in open battle, Severus had already secured Rome itself, dealt with the immediate crisis of Julianus's fall, and begun turning the full weight of his own already mobilized legions eastward, meaning Niger, for all the genuine strength of his eastern command, would ultimately be forced to fight a defensive campaign against an opponent who had already claimed the capital and the legitimacy, however contested, that came with it. Clodius Albinus, governor of Britain, occupied a genuinely different strategic position than either of his rival claimants, commanding a substantial garrison force on the empire's northwestern frontier but facing, like Niger, the considerable logistical challenge of moving that force across a significant distance to contest the throne directly. Severus's decision to offer Albinus the junior rank of Caesar, rather than confronting him as an open rival from the outset, reflected a shrewd recognition that fighting two capable rivals simultaneously on two distant fronts risked overextending his own position, even with the advantage of having already secured Rome itself. Albinus, for his part, accepted the arrangement, whether from genuine belief in Severus's offer of eventual shared authority, from a pragmatic recognition that his own more distant British command left him poorly positioned to contest the throne immediately, or from simple calculated patience, waiting to see how the more immediate contest between Severus and Niger in the east would resolve before committing his own forces to a wider conflict. Coins minted during this period bearing both men's titles survive as physical evidence of the arrangement's genuine, if temporary, formal recognition. This arrangement held only as long as it served both men's immediate interests. Once Severus had successfully dealt with Niger's eastern challenge, the temporary peace between Rome's two remaining claimants to supreme power would prove, as both men surely understood from the outset, merely a postponement of the final reckoning between them rather than any genuine long-term settlement. A reckoning this telling will return to once the more immediate crisis of Julianus's fall has been fully resolved. Among Severus's earliest acts upon securing the city was the staging of an elaborate public funeral and consecration ceremony for Pertinax, a deliberate piece of political theater. Cassius Dio, who witnessed it directly, describes in unusually vivid detail, evidence of just how carefully Severus understood the symbolic value of publicly honoring the murdered emperor whose death he claimed to be avenging. Since Pertinax's actual body had already been buried in the immediate aftermath of his killing, Severus arranged instead for an elaborate wax effigy of the dead emperor, dressed in triumphal robes, to be displayed on an ivory couch in the forum, attended by mourners and ceremonial guards as though the emperor himself lay in state before the assembled Roman public. The effigy was subsequently carried in a grand procession through the city, accompanied by images representing the various peoples and provinces of the empire, before being ceremonially burned atop a specially constructed multi-tiered pyre in the Campus Martius, an act Roman religious tradition understood as releasing the deceased emperor's soul upward to join the gods. The same act of formal deification Severus had already arranged for the Senate to confirm, now given its full public ceremonial expression before the eyes of the entire city. Dio's account lingers particularly on the genuine emotion the ceremony produced among many in the watching crowd, whatever cynical political calculation underlay Severus's decision to stage it. A testament to how thoroughly the manner of Pertinax's murder, and the naked cash transaction that had followed it, had shocked ordinary Roman sensibilities regardless of how briefly his own reforming reign had actually lasted. By publicly and lavishly honoring the murdered emperor's memory, Severus positioned himself, in the clearest possible ceremonial terms, as the restorer of an order the Praetorian Guard's auction had so grievously violated, a piece of theater considerably more effective at winning public sentiment than any battlefield victory could achieve on its own. As Severus's army drew closer to Rome, the Senate, reading the situation with the same self-preserving instinct the Praetorian Guard itself was now displaying, formally condemned Didius Julianus and declared Septimius Severus the legitimate emperor instead, a reversal made considerably easier by how thin Julianus's own claim to legitimacy had been from the very start of his purchased reign. The Praetorian Guard, whose soldiers had installed Julianus in exchange for an enormous cash donative barely 2 months earlier, made no meaningful attempt to defend him against Severus's approaching legions. Several accounts suggest the Guard itself participated in, or at minimum offered no resistance to, the Emperor's removal, a final, bitter irony given that the entire crisis had begun with their own killing of Pertinax and their own auctioning of the throne meant to replace him. Didius Julianus was killed within the imperial palace on the order of the Senate, executed by a soldier sent for the purpose rather than in any battle or public spectacle, bringing his reign to an end after 66 days, one of the shortest reigns in the long history of the Roman Principate, purchased at a staggering price and surrendered, in the end, without any serious resistance at all. Some accounts preserve his final words as a bewildered protest that he had, after all, done no genuine wrong beyond paying for what the soldiers themselves had freely offered to sell, a final, almost pitiable attempt to shift moral responsibility for the entire transaction back onto the men who had first proposed it, an argument that history, whatever its private sympathies, has never fully accepted on his behalf. Septimius Severus entered Rome shortly afterward, and one of his first significant acts as emperor addressed the very institution that had precipitated the entire crisis. He summoned the Praetorian Guard, ostensibly to receive them in a ceremonial capacity befitting the new emperor's arrival, then had them surrounded by his own loyal legionary troops, positioned in advance around the assembly ground without the Guard's knowledge. Once surrounded, the Praetorians were stripped of their weapons and ceremonial status in full public view, a deliberate humiliation calculated to demonstrate, as visibly as possible, the reversal of fortune the Guard had brought upon itself through its own transactional betrayal of Pertinax and its auctioning of his throne. Herodian describes the soldiers, so recently the most powerful arbiters of the empire's fate, marched out of the city stripped of their military belts and decorations, forbidden ever again from approaching within a set distance of Rome on pain of death, a permanent banishment from the very capital they had so recently controlled outright. The soldiers responsible for killing one emperor and selling the office to another were formally disbanded and expelled from the city, permanently dismissed from the privileged position they had so catastrophically abused. In their place, Severus established a new Praetorian Guard, drawn this time from the ranks of his own loyal frontier legions rather than from the traditionally privileged recruitment pools of Italy. A deliberate structural change intended to ensure that no future guard would hold quite the same dangerous, semi-independent leverage over the imperial succession that this one had just demonstrated so catastrophically. The irony of the old guard's fate was not lost on contemporary observers. The very soldiers who had taught Rome that the throne could be bought had themselves been unable to purchase their own survival once a rival with genuine military force at his back finally arrived at the gates they had once stood upon so confidently, their entire fortune and position undone within a single humiliating ceremony they had no power whatsoever to resist. Having secured the capital, Severus moved with characteristic political sophistication to consolidate a legitimacy considerably more durable than the crude cash transaction that had briefly elevated his predecessor. He arranged for Pertinax to be formally deified by the Senate, a traditional Roman honor reserved for emperors judged worthy of a form of official, posthumous divine status, and adopted elements of the murdered emperor's memory into his own public image, presenting himself as Pertinax's avenger and rightful successor rather than merely another general who had won a race to the capital. In a further and more audacious move, Severus later had himself formally adopted, retroactively and largely for symbolic purposes, into the family of the deified Marcus Aurelius, linking his own new dynasty to the memory of the last widely respected emperor before the troubles of Commodus's reign had begun the empire's slide toward crisis. A calculated piece of dynastic theater that allowed Severus to present his own rule as a restoration of the stable, respected Antonine tradition rather than simply the latest and most successful contender in a naked contest of frontier armies. Coinage from this period reflects the new emphasis explicitly, bearing legends celebrating Severus's connection to the Antonine line alongside more traditional imagery of military victory. These measures, combined with the disbanding and humiliation of the old guard, allowed Severus to begin his reign with a genuine claim to restored order that neither Pertinax's brief, doomed reforms nor Julianus's purchased legitimacy had ever managed to achieve. Yet Severus's position remained genuinely incomplete so long as two rival claimants, Niger in the east and the newly demoted Albinus in the west, still commanded substantial armies of their own. Unfinished business that would occupy the following several years of his reign before the empire's convulsions from this single chaotic year could finally be said to have run their full course. Severus turned his attention eastward against Pessinus Niger in 194, marching his own veteran legions toward Syria while Niger, having spent months consolidating his eastern position, prepared to meet the challenge with the substantial forces under his own command. The decisive engagement came at the Battle of Issus, fought near a location already famous in ancient memory as the site of Alexander the Great's celebrated victory over the Persian king Darius more than 5 centuries earlier. A historical echo contemporary writers were quick to note, whatever its purely coincidental significance to the actual military outcome. Severus's forces, benefiting from superior organization and the momentum of having already secured Rome and its considerable resources, decisively defeated Niger's eastern army in a hard-fought engagement, reportedly aided by a violent storm that struck during the battle and disrupted Niger's own lines at a critical moment. Niger himself fled the battlefield but was captured and killed shortly afterward while attempting to escape toward Parthian territory beyond the empire's eastern frontier, his severed head, according to several surviving accounts, subsequently displayed as proof of his defeat, and a grim echo of the fate that had befallen Pertinax at the very start of the crisis. Severus followed his victory with a punitive campaign against several eastern cities that had supported Niger's cause, most notably the wealthy city of Byzantium, which endured a prolonged siege of nearly 3 years before finally falling to Severus's forces, a demonstration, not unlike similar punitive campaigns waged by conquerors across many other empires and eras, that resistance to the eventual victor of a succession crisis carried lasting consequences well beyond the immediate battlefield outcome. With the eastern challenge resolved, only Clodius Albinus in the west remained to contest Severus's now considerably strengthened claim to sole rule. The uneasy peace between Severus and Albinus, maintained through the junior rank of Caesar Severus, had granted his western rival during the campaign against Niger, collapsed once the eastern threat had been fully eliminated. Severus, no longer needing to guard against a two-front conflict, moved to strip Albinus of his position and titles, prompting the British governor to declare himself emperor in his own right and cross with his legions into Gaul to contest the succession by force. The two armies met in 197 near the city of Lugdunum, in what is now the region of Lyon in France, in a battle later Roman historians would remember as one of the largest and bloodiest engagements fought between Roman armies in the empire's entire history, involving, by some ancient estimates, well over 100,000 soldiers drawn from legions on both sides of the contest, a staggering scale of Roman fighting Roman that few other episodes in the empire's history would ever match. The battle proved close and hard-fought, with Severus's own forces reportedly suffering a serious reversal at one stage, Severus himself nearly unseated from his horse and forced to fight on foot amid the confusion, before his cavalry, arriving at a decisive moment under a subordinate commander, turned the tide of the engagement in his favor. Albinus, defeated, took his own life rather than face capture, and Severus, in a final act of retribution, reportedly had the body mistreated and displayed before ordering it disposed of, a harsh coda to a rivalry that had cost the lives of tens of thousands of Roman soldiers on both sides. Now finally the sole and unchallenged claimant to the throne his frontier legions had proclaimed him 5 years earlier. Severus could at last turn his full attention to governing the empire the year of the 5 emperors had thrown into such extraordinary turmoil. The long chain of consequences set in motion by a single auction outside a Roman military camp had, at last, run its complete and exhausting course. Beyond the dramatic events unfolding among emperors, generals, and the Praetorian Guard, ordinary daily life in Rome continued, however unsettled, throughout the months of crisis. A reminder that the empire's vast urban population had to eat, work, and conduct business regardless of who currently occupied the palace on the Palatine Hill. The city depended on a continuous supply of grain shipped from Egypt and North Africa to feed a population numbering, by most modern estimates, close to 1 million residents, an administrative and logistical system whose smooth operation mattered enormously to civic stability regardless of the political drama unfolding among the elite, and any serious disruption to which risked provoking unrest far more immediate and dangerous to a sitting emperor than any distant frontier army. Uncertainty at the top of Roman society inevitably created anxiety further down its social ladder as well, with merchants and property owners uncertain how any given emperor's policies on taxation, currency, or trade might shift depending on which claimant ultimately prevailed, and ordinary residents watching for signs, troop movements, Senate proclamations, changes in the coinage bearing each new emperor's portrait, that might offer some indication of which way the crisis was likely to resolve. Coinage itself, minted rapidly to reflect each new claimant's accession, offers modern historians a genuinely useful physical record of the crisis's shifting fortunes. New portraits and titles appearing and vanishing from circulation within weeks as first Pertinax, then Julianus, then Severus claimed the mint's official recognition in turn. The city's temples and public spaces, meanwhile, continued to host the ordinary rhythms of Roman religious and civic life even amid the turmoil, a continuity some ancient writers found worth remarking upon precisely because it illustrated how thoroughly Roman urban society had developed institutions and habits resilient enough to persist through even the most extraordinary disruptions at the very top of its political structure. Whatever emperor eventually secured the throne, the bakers, the grain merchants, the temple priests, and the countless ordinary Romans whose labor sustained the city's daily life would still need to be there to greet him. Behind every claimant in this crisis stood the same underlying institution, the Roman legion, a professional military force whose structure and culture had evolved, by this period, into a genuinely sophisticated instrument of both warfare and political power in its own right. A legion of this era typically numbered somewhere around 5,000 men, organized into smaller tactical units called centuries and cohorts, commanded by a hierarchy of officers ranging from centurions promoted through the ranks for demonstrated competence to senior legates typically drawn from the senatorial class. A structure that combined genuine professional meritocracy at its lower and middle ranks with more traditional aristocratic privilege at its very top. Roman legionary service by this period had become a genuine long-term career rather than the temporary citizen levy of the earlier republic, with soldiers typically serving terms of 25 years or more in exchange for regular pay, occasional donatives, and, crucially, a substantial cash payment or grant of land upon honorable discharge. An arrangement that gave the legions a professional, standing character and a soldier's own vested interest in the stability and generosity of whichever emperor currently commanded their loyalty. This professionalization cut both ways for any sitting emperor. A well-paid, well-led legion could provide genuinely reliable loyalty across an entire career of service, but a legion whose pay fell into arrears, whose commander proved incompetent or unpopular, or whose expectations of donative and reward went unmet, possessed both the organizational cohesion and the practical military capability to become a serious political threat rather than a simple instrument of imperial will. Precisely the dynamic that had turned the Praetorian Guard from Pertinax's protectors into his killers within the span of a single winter, and that would soon carry 3 separate legionary armies into open civil war over who Rome's rightful master should be. The frontier legions in Pannonia, Syria, and Britain that would soon proclaim Severus, Niger, and Albinus each differed from the Praetorian Guard in one crucial respect. They had spent years, in some cases decades, engaged in genuine, grinding frontier warfare against real external enemies, a hardening of professional competence and discipline the comparatively pampered and comfortable guard in Rome had never been required to match, a difference in genuine military capability that would prove decisive once the rival claims moved from rhetoric to the battlefield. The crisis of 193 illustrates, with unusual clarity, a structural tension that had run through Roman imperial governance since its very founding. An empire whose legitimate political theory rested on the Senate's formal authority and, increasingly under the Antonine emperors, the orderly transfer of power to a carefully chosen successor, but whose actual physical security depended entirely on the loyalty of professional soldiers who answered, in practice, to whichever commander could pay, discipline, and inspire them most effectively. This tension had simmered beneath the surface of Roman politics for generations, occasionally erupting into open crisis, as in the year of the 4 emperors, but more often managed successfully through the careful cultivation of military loyalty by emperors who understood, whatever their public philosophical pretensions, that their own survival depended on keeping the legions and the Praetorian Guard reasonably satisfied. Marcus Aurelius's own reign had managed this balance skillfully, personally sharing the hardships of frontier campaigning with his soldiers rather than merely commanding from a comfortable distance. His son Commodus, and the crisis that followed his death, revealed just how quickly that balance could collapse once an emperor's personal conduct or fiscal policy alienated the very soldiers whose loyalty the entire system depended upon. The lesson Severus drew from the crisis reflected clearly in his subsequent reforms, disbanding and reconstituting the Praetorian Guard on more loyal foundations, increasing military pay considerably to secure the legion's ongoing loyalty, and famously advising his own sons, according to later tradition, to enrich the soldiers and disregard everyone else, represented a genuinely honest, if cynical, acknowledgement of where Roman imperial power had always actually resided beneath its senates. Ceremonial trappings. The auction had not created this reality, it had simply forced the whole of Roman society to confront, in the most undignified terms imaginable, a truth the empire's political structure had always contained. Throughout this entire crisis, the Roman Senate occupied a position of genuine constitutional dignity that had, by this period in imperial history, come to mean considerably less in practical terms than its formal powers might suggest. Composed of several hundred men drawn from Rome's wealthiest and most established families, supplemented by successful provincial administrators and military officers elevated to senatorial rank through imperial favor, the Senate retained formal authority over a range of civic and legal matters, and its ceremonial confirmation remained, in constitutional theory, a necessary step in any emperor's legitimate accession to the throne. In practice, however, the Senate of this era possessed no independent armed force of its own capable of enforcing its will against a determined military faction, a structural weakness that had been true since the earliest days of the Principate, but which the events of 193 exposed with unusual, almost humiliating clarity. Senators could debate, could formally ratify or condemn a given claimant, and could, as they eventually did with both Julianus and later with Albinus, throw their ceremonial weight behind whichever candidate appeared most likely to actually prevail, but they could not, on their own, prevent the Praetorian Guard from auctioning the throne in the first place, nor compel any of the three rival generals to abandon their competing claims once the crisis had begun. Cassius Dio's own account, written from the perspective of a senator who lived through these humiliating months personally, conveys a genuine undercurrent of bitterness at the body's practical powerlessness, just as it necessarily was in the outward forms of continued dignity and ceremonial function. The Senate that formally confirmed Julianus, then formally condemned him weeks later, then formally confirmed Severus in his place, was, in each case, simply ratifying decisions that soldiers with weapons had already made for them, a pattern of constitutional theater over a reality of naked military power that the crisis of 193 revealed more starkly than perhaps any other single episode in the Senate's long imperial history. The practice of paying soldiers a special cash donative upon a new emperor's accession predated the crisis of 193 by more than a century, tracing back to the very founding of the Principate under Augustus, who had distributed substantial bequests to the legions and the newly formed Praetorian Guard in his own will, establishing a precedent every subsequent emperor felt obligated, to varying degrees, to honor upon assuming the throne. Over the generations that followed, this practice of accession donatives grew steadily more expected and more expensive, as each new emperor, anxious to secure the loyalty of soldiers who had played no part in choosing him, competed implicitly against the generosity of his predecessors, creating a slow but steady inflationary pressure on the price of the Guard's loyalty that the crisis of 193 brought to its logical and, for the imperial treasury, genuinely alarming conclusion. Pertinax's fatal error, in this context, was not simply excessive reforming zeal in the abstract, but his specific failure to honor this decades-long pattern of expectation at the very moment his own accession most required it, a miscalculation that, whatever the genuine merit of his broader fiscal reforms, left the Guard primed to conclude that its own financial interests might be better served by a more generous alternative, whoever that alternative might eventually prove to be. Julianus's winning bid of 25,000 sesterces per soldier, several times the size of any previous accession donative in Roman history, represented not merely personal extravagance but the direct, almost mathematical consequence of this century-long inflationary trend finally being tested against genuine open competition rather than a single emperor's unilateral generosity, the market, in effect, having been allowed to set its own price for the first time, with predictably dramatic results. A promise Julianus's own subsequent brief and impoverished reign proved almost entirely unable to actually honor in full before his fall. Nearly everything modern readers know about the events of 193 comes from two surviving historical accounts, each written by an author with his own vantage point, biases, and distance from the events he described, a fact worth examining directly since it shapes how confidently any particular detail in this story can be treated as established fact. Cassius Dio, a Roman senator of Greek origin who held high office across several subsequent reigns, including his own consulship decades after the crisis, claims direct personal witness to several of the events he describes, including the Senate proceedings that confirmed both Julianus's accession and his later condemnation. A genuinely rare degree of first-hand access among ancient historians, though one that came filtered through Dio's own position as a senator with his own political interests and later relationships with the very Severan dynasty whose rise he was describing. Herodian, a somewhat later writer of less certain social standing than Dio, composed his own history of the period, focusing more heavily on dramatic narrative and moral characterization than Dio's more administratively detailed account, and modern historians generally treat his version as valuable corroboration on major events while approaching his more colorful anecdotal details, such as the specific hand signals attributed to Julianus at the camp gate, with somewhat greater caution than Dio's closer eyewitness testimony deserves. Where the two accounts agree on the broad sequence of Pertinax's death, the fact and approximate scale of the auction, and the eventual triumph of Severus over his rivals, modern historians treat the underlying events as well established. Where they differ on specific details, particularly regarding the precise words exchanged during the bidding or the exact motivations of individual participants, this telling has favored the more cautious, hedged version of events, consistent with how any responsible modern account of this remarkable and well-documented crisis ought to proceed. Beyond the practical machinery of army pay and Senate ceremony, Roman imperial authority rested on a deeper layer of religious and symbolic meaning that the auction outside the Praetorian camp had, in its raw transactional bluntness, threatened to expose as hollow. Since the reign of Augustus, deceased emperors judged worthy of the honor could be formally deified by the Senate, entered into the state's official religious calendar with their own temples, priests, and rites of worship, a practice that blurred, deliberately, the line between the emperor as a political office and the emperor as a figure touched by genuine divine sanction, reinforcing the idea that imperial authority descended from something considerably grander than mere military force or Senate vote. The physical trappings of the office reinforced this same message at every turn. The distinctive purple dye worn in an emperor's ceremonial robes, extracted at enormous cost from a particular species of sea snail found along the eastern Mediterranean coast, had for centuries carried associations with royalty and divine favor that ordinary Romans encountered constantly in public ceremony, statuary, and coinage bearing the emperor's image. A visual and material language of legitimacy that no amount of purchased loyalty from the Praetorian Guard could genuinely replicate on its own. This is precisely why Julianus's reign, whatever the technical legality of the Senate's ratification, never escaped the taint of its purchased origins in the eyes of the wider Roman public. He wore the purple and received the formal acclamations, but he could not manufacture the deeper sense of divinely sanctioned legitimacy that the office's centuries of accumulated ceremony and religious meaning were meant to confer, and that his own obviously transactional path to the throne had stripped away before he ever set foot back inside the city walls. Severus, by contrast, understood instinctively that reclaiming this symbolic dimension of the office through deification of Pertinax, adoption into the Antonine line, and careful cultivation of religious and astrological legitimacy through his marriage to Julia Domna, mattered every bit as much to his ultimate success as the military victories that actually delivered him the throne. Roman political culture of this era placed considerable weight on omens, portents, and other signs believed to reveal divine favor or displeasure regarding a given ruler's legitimacy, a belief system that shaped how contemporary observers interpreted nearly every major event of the crisis, from Commodus's strange final years to the eventual triumph of Severus over his rivals. Ancient sources record a range of supposed omens associated with Julianus's brief and unhappy reign, reports of unfavorable sacrifices, strange occurrences interpreted after the fact as warnings the gods themselves had disapproved of a throne obtained through mere cash payment rather than legitimate succession or conquest. Severus, by contrast, cultivated a public image considerably more attentive to these same conventions of divine sanction, emphasizing his marriage to Julia Domna, with her family's own reputation for religious and astrological insight, and later commissioning public monuments and coinage explicitly associating his new dynasty with divine favor and the restored stability of the deified Marcus Aurelius's own remembered golden age. Whether any individual Roman genuinely believed these omens carried literal supernatural weight, or understood them chiefly as a familiar political language for expressing approval or disapproval of a given ruler's legitimacy, the surviving sources make clear that this vocabulary of divine sanction mattered enormously to how the crisis was processed and narrated by contemporaries. A reminder that even an episode as starkly transactional as an army literally auctioning the throne still required. In the eyes of the wider Roman public, some accompanying claimed to higher legitimacy before it could be fully accepted or, in Julianus's case, fully rejected. Much of what modern historians can independently verify about this crisis, beyond the sometimes contradictory testimony of Cassius Dio and Herodian, comes from an unexpected and remarkably durable source: the coins minted during these turbulent months, struck rapidly by each successive claimant to broadcast his own accession across an empire that received most of its news of distant political events through exactly this kind of physical, circulating evidence. Surviving coins bearing Pertinax's portrait and titles, minted in the brief weeks of his reign, confirm the genuine if short-lived reality of his accession independent of any literary account, while coins issued under Julianus's name, considerably scarcer given his own brief 66 days in power, offer physical proof that the mint's official machinery genuinely recognized and processed his purchased claim to the throne, however contested that claim proved to be everywhere else in the empire. Numismatic evidence from Severus's own early coinage reveals, with particular clarity, the careful legitimizing narrative he worked to construct in the crisis's aftermath, legends explicitly proclaiming him the avenger of Pertinax's murder, and, following his later adoption into the Antonine family, new titles linking his name directly to the deified Marcus Aurelius's own remembered lineage. Coins minted during the temporary alliance with Clodius Albinus similarly survive, bearing both men's names and titles side by side. Physical confirmation of an arrangement literary sources describe, but which the coinage itself preserves in a form no chronicler's potential bias or later embellishment could meaningfully distort. This physical, contemporary evidence matters enormously to modern historians precisely because it exists independently of Cassius Dio's senatorial perspective or Herodian's more dramatic narrative instincts, offering a check against either author's potential exaggeration or error. Where the coinage confirms the broader outline the literary sources describe, the rapid, chaotic succession of claimants, the careful legitimizing efforts Severus undertook once his position was secure, Modern historians can treat the underlying narrative with a confidence that purely literary evidence, however detailed, could never quite provide on its own. Septimius Severus would go on to rule for nearly 2 decades following his final victory over Albinus, founding a dynasty that would govern Rome through his sons and later relatives. For several further decades after his own death in the year 211, campaigning as far as the northern frontier of Britain in his final years and dying at the city of Eboracum, modern York, while still actively engaged in the business of frontier defense that had first brought him to power. His reforms to military pay and to the Praetorian Guard's composition proved durable, reshaping the practical relationship between Roman emperors and the soldiers upon whom their power ultimately depended for the remainder of the dynasty's rule and well beyond it. The dynasty's own succession, however, would prove far from harmonious. Severus's sons Caracalla and Geta, jointly proclaimed co-emperors upon their father's death, descended almost immediately into open and bitter rivalry, dividing the palace itself into rival factions and reportedly refusing even to dine together for fear of poison, a conflict Caracalla resolved within the year by having his own brother murdered, reportedly in their mother Julia Domna's own presence, a grim echo of the family betrayals and violent successions that had marked the crisis there. Father's own rise had grown out of. Julia Domna herself continued to wield genuine political influence through her son's reigns and beyond, a woman whose own remarkable career, from provincial priestly family to empress and effective political counselor at the very center of Roman power, would have seemed almost unimaginable to the frightened senators watching Julianus's bidding war unfold outside the Praetorian camp barely 2 decades earlier. The empire that Severus's dynasty inherited from the chaos of 193 would carry forward, and its military structure and its uneasy relationship between imperial authority and armed force, lessons the crisis had taught in the starkest possible terms. Severus's own reforms, whatever their genuine sophistication, could not permanently resolve the underlying tension the crisis of 193 had exposed so starkly. An empire whose real security rested on the loyalty of armed men who now understood, with total clarity, that they held the power to make emperors, and, when sufficiently provoked or sufficiently well paid by a rival, to unmake them just as readily. The Severan dynasty itself would eventually fall victim to this same underlying dynamic, its final representative, a teenage cousin of Caracalla's known to history as Severus Alexander, murdered by his own mutinous soldiers in the year 235 in circumstances that echoed, in their essential shape, the fate that had befallen Pertinax more than 4 decades earlier, a disgruntled army, an emperor who had failed to satisfy its expectations, and a swift, violent removal followed by the elevation of whichever commander the soldiers currently favored. The decades that followed Severus Alexander's death would come to be remembered by later historians as a period of such severe and repeated military usurpation, provincial fragmentation, and rapid imperial turnover that modern scholars often refer to it simply as the crisis of the 3rd century, an era in which emperors, many of them risen from common military rank rather than senatorial or dynastic privilege, could rule for mere months before falling to the next general willing to offer his own soldiers a more generous reward for their loyalty. Viewed from this longer vantage, the auction outside the Praetorian camp in 193 reads less as an isolated aberration than as an early, unusually blunt preview of a dynamic Roman imperial politics would never fully escape for the remainder of its long history, that the throne, whatever its accumulated ceremony and claimed divine sanction, belonged in practice to whichever armed force proved willing and able to seize or purchase it, a lesson the empire's own soldiers once taught it so plainly by. The events of a single winter would prove remarkably unwilling to unlearn across the turbulent century that followed. You have walked, across these hours, from a rampart outside Rome where soldiers auctioned an empire to the highest bidder, through the golden reign that preceded the collapse and the spoiled inheritance that followed it, through the collapse of a reforming emperor's brief reign, the transactional logic that let common cash overturn centuries of constitutional tradition, and the swift, violent reckoning that followed as the empire's frontier armies refused to accept what the capital's own guardians had done. You have followed two rival generals to their own defeats in the east and the west, watched the dynasty rise from the wreckage of a single winter's chaos, and traced the long, uneven road by which one province's frontier commander became master of the entire known world, only to inherit, in the fullness of time, the very same vulnerability to its own soldiers that had made that chaos possible in the first place. Consider what this story asks of you, beneath its remarkable, almost absurd particulars, that institutions meant to protect power can, gradually and without any single dramatic betrayal, come to see that power is something to be sold rather than served, and that once an army has learned it can name an emperor for cash, no amount of Senate ceremony can fully restore the illusion that the office was ever above such transactions in the first place. No single soldier decided this alone, and no single senator could have prevented it alone. The auction was the accumulated weight of a century of small accommodations, each one individually reasonable, together amounting to a lesson no Roman emperor after this winter could ever again afford to forget. Consider, too, the particular cruelty of Didius Julianus's fate within this larger story, a man of otherwise ordinary and creditable public service, remembered by the historians who outlived him not for decades of provincial administration or faithful consular duty, but for a single desperate evening's bidding outside a fortified camp, and act his own descendants, had he left any of note, would have had little choice but to live down for the remainder of their lives. History's judgment, in this sense, proved considerably less forgiving than the Guard's own soldiers, who accepted his coin readily enough before abandoning him just as readily the moment a better armed alternative arrived at the gates. Septimius Severus went on to found a dynasty that ruled Rome for decades after the chaos of this single year finally settled, his reforms to the Praetorian Guard outlasting his own reign by generations. But the precedent the auction set, that the throne of Rome could, in the right circumstances, simply be purchased, could be dismantled in its particulars without ever being fully unlearned by the soldiers who guarded every emperor who followed. Weigh, too, the strange fact that 3 men wore the purple within the span of a single winter, and that the chroniclers who outlived them judged each so differently despite the identical suddenness of their falls. Pertinax was judged a reformer who came too late and asked too much too soon of men grown fat on a predecessor's indulgence. Julianus was judged, more or less alone among all the emperors this empire had yet produced, as the man who paid for the office outright, his name reduced in Dio's own account to a byword for the folly of mistaking a soldier's temporary loyalty for a durable claim to rule. And Severus was judged the outsider who saw clearly what his 2 predecessors had not, that the throne belonged, in the end, to whoever understood most completely what it actually cost to keep it, and was willing to pay that price not once, at the gate, but continuously, for as long as the crown remained on his head. Consider, finally, the strange symmetry running through the whole affair from beginning to end, an emperor killed for failing to pay his soldiers enough, replaced by a man who paid them everything they asked, who was in turn replaced by a general who understood, better than either of his predecessors, that the soldier's loyalty could never be permanently purchased at all, only rented, one generous reign at a time, from men who had learned, once and for all, exactly what their loyalty was worth, and exactly how quickly they were willing to sell it again to the next bidder who arrived at their gates. Let the ramparts stand empty now, the soldiers long since dispersed to their new postings, the bidding voices long since fallen silent over walls that time itself would eventually wear down to nothing. Let the crowd that once gathered before those walls disperse as well, back to bakeries and workshops and temples that never once stopped needing tending, regardless of which man's portrait the mint struck onto its coins that season. Let the story close here, in the aftermath of an empire that once, for 66 strange days, belonged to whoever could pay for it, a throne bought in the open air, sold by men who had sworn to guard it, and an empire left, ever afterward, to reckon with what that single transaction had revealed about the true foundations of its power.